Míche, and welcome to episode number 4 of Ancient Landscapes with myself, Tine. In this 6-part series, I will be selecting some of my favourite landscapes in Ireland's ancient East and taking a journey back through the ages to uncover some of their hidden mysteries. We'll explore the ruins of some of our most famous landmarks and the myths and legends which reside there, with interviews from experts and amateur enthusiasts alike to guide us along the way. In the first episode of this series, we explored the sacred sites at the hills of Tara and Slane, but Louth too has its own sacred hill at Faughart, just 5 kilometres northeast of Dundalk town. And in 2005, a report was released detailing 34 archaeological excavations which had taken place between Faughart and Little Mill on the RD Road as part of the construction process behind the M1 Dundalk Western Bypass. These findings were a revelation to fans of history in the North Louth area, adding weight to some of the local legends and lore and casting doubt over others. In this episode, we will further explore some of these revelations, particularly in relation to 2 of Faughart's most famous associated figures, Edward de Bruce and Brigid of Faughart. We'll also be chatting with 2 of the archaeologists who worked on the dig a little later on to help us fill in some of the gaps. But firstly, let us take a trip back into Faughart's ancient past. Based on the Neolithic cooking pits and ceremonial sites found in the area, it's safe to assume that people have been living on and around the hill itself for up to 5,000 years. Indeed, the unusually large number of ceremonial sites found between Faughart and Newtown Balregan paints a picture of a much larger sacred complex, comparable to those at the Boyne Valley and the complex at Tara in County Meath or Owenwaka in County Armagh. And it is from this magical landscape that one of Ireland's most influential sacred figures was born. Although opinion differs on whether St. Brigid was a historical person or merely a mythical fable, there can be no question as to her importance to both the pagan and Christian mythologies. The hagiographies tell us that she was born in Faughart in the year 453 and died in 524 in her 70s, and that her most important achievement was the establishment of her abbey at Kildare at the age of 17. But this doesn't tell us what her life in 5th century Faughart would have been like, or how it prepared her for her legendary journey to Kildare. These can only be discovered through a visit to the Holy Ground itself, one of the last southern outposts on the Slí Milluachra before you reached Ulster. Faughart, like other Gaelic territories, would have been ruled over by its chieftains. One such chieftain was Dubhthach, a man with a wandering eye. He'd had a tryst with his household bondsmaid named Brookshock, who became pregnant. Upon learning this, Dubhthach's unnamed wife took issue and insisted that the girl immediately be banished to Moreau in East Limerick. The child she gave birth to was named Brigid, meaning exalted one, and was sent off to fosterage in the home of a druid. When she came of age to be useful as a servant, Dubhthach did the customary thing and sent for Brigid, who carried out her duties of minding the livestock and serving food and drink to the family at mealtimes. In addition to this, Brigid kept a store of food and clothes aside for the poor, much to the annoyance of her father's wife, who persisted in trying to rid her household of the girl. Eventually, Dubhthach relented to his wife's demands. He put Brigid in a chariot and drove her to the household of the King of Leinster, where he tried to strike a deal with the king concerning Brigid's future. Whilst Dubhthach was inside negotiating with the king, Brigid was approached in the chariot outside by a leper who asked her for alms. Brigid gave him her father's sword. Upon his return with the king and discovering his sword was gone, Dubhthach was furious. The king calmed him down and told him that Brigid's worth in God's eyes was greater than their own. Thus, with her father, Brigid returned to Faughart a freed woman. It wasn't long before her father was once again plotting to be rid of her, this time through marriage. Being the rather comely daughter of a powerful chieftain in a significant part of the kingdom of Oriel, Brigid would have made a fine match for any suitor. Indeed, the stories tell us that she was approached for her hand by a filla or poet who would have been of equal rank to a king. But rather than succumb to a life of marital distraction, Brigid asked God to take away her beauty. then put her eye out from its socket to make double sure. The rock where her eye fell and left a dent is said to be the very one that stands at her shrine today, with the knee stone said to be marked by her knees from her long hours in prayer. Faughart was later named for the Faughart, a medieval people known as the people of St. Brigid. And Brigid went on to become associated with poets, with healing and charity, with the tending of livestock, the hearth fire, and the forge. The forge, a common feature throughout most of the history of Irish society. It would have been the first stop for men in need of a weapon or a freshly shod horse, and if any man was in need of such, it was Edward de Bruce. His older brother Robert was leading Scotland in their struggle for independence from England, and had sent a letter to every king in Ireland asking for allies and appealing to the shared Celtic culture and language between the Scottish and Irish peoples. He received support from Irish chieftains who needed help driving back the Anglo-Norman occupiers in Ulster, and immediately set his sights upon opening up a second front in Ireland for England to defend, in hopes that it would level the playing field a bit for Scotland's grasp at freedom. However, his brother Edward had designs of his own. He had been successfully leading Robert's men to battle for the better part of a decade, and indeed had been tempted with thoughts of a crown of his own by none other than William Wallace, Scotland's most famous rebel. Wallace had offered him the kingship of Scotland in the event Robert did not accept it, or in the event of Robert's death. Edward then may well have been disappointed upon Robert's accession, and when the opportunity arose to expand Scotland's dominion, Edward set sail for Ireland with 6,000 men in May of 1315, with a view to ruling in his own right. An account of Edward's life by the Archdeacon of Aberdeen describes it thus. Sir Edward Bruce, the Earl of Carrick, who was bolder than a leopard and had no desire to be at peace, thought Scotland too small for his brother and himself. Therefore he set his purpose to be King of Ireland. Unfortunately for all involved, this task would prove a lot more difficult than he could ever have imagined. Edward's army were poorly resourced due to the devastating famine which swept right across Europe in the year 1315. Livestock across the continent is said to have decreased by up to 80% during this period, and crops didn't fully recover until 1322. And after 3 years of his so-called Irish Liberation campaign, the native Irish considered de Bruce's army to be as much an occupying force as the English or Normans ever were. The last thing Ireland needed was another foreign occupier to feed, especially when they wrought the kind of careless destruction Edward came to be known for. An example of this was his first visit to Dundalk after reaching Ireland. De Bruce launched a devastating attack on Dundalk town, indiscriminately killing Anglo-Norman soldiers and Gaelic civilians alike. He plundered the churches, raided the food and burned the houses. It's said that the streets ran red with blood. Likewise, he is said to have continued onward to the Anglo-Norman stronghold at Roche Castle, which the accounts tell us was then attacked and burned, and which we'll be exploring in the next episode of the series. By the 14th of October in the year 1318, after once again hitting up Dundalk for supplies, Edward had arrived in Faughart, ready to face Anglo-Norman troops under John de Birmingham in battle. One particularly colourful 13th century account of the battle, written by Carlingford man Thomas D'Arcy McGee, tells it such. At the head of the vanguard, without waiting for the whole of his company to come up, Bruce charged the enemy with impetuosity. Master John de Maupas, a burgher of Dundalk, believing that the death of the Scottish leader would be the signal for the retreat of his followers, disguised as a jester or fool, sought him throughout the field. One of the royal esquires named Gilbert Harper, wearing the surcoat of his master, was mistaken for him and slain, but the true leader was at length found by de Maupas and struck down with the blow of a leaden plummet or slingshot. After the battle, when the field was searched for his body, it was found under that of de Maupas, who had bravely yielded up life for life. Although it is possible that D'Arcy McGee exaggerated this tale somewhat, it is true that de Bruce was killed in battle by Sir John de Maupas. The medieval annals of Ulster have this to say about the incident. There was not done from the beginning of the world a deed that was better for the men of Ireland than that deed. For there came death and loss of people during his time in all Ireland in general, for the space of 3 years and a half, and people undoubtedly used to eat each other throughout Ireland. Accounts differ about what happened to Edward's body afterwards, but all were equally gruesome. You'd never know what to look at his final resting place in the scenic old Faughart graveyard, though. If only he'd taken a leaf from Brigid's book and given his sword away. There was some hope of finding the battle or burial grounds of the Battle of Faughart when excavation began in the early 2000s. Despite extensive searching, though, no evidence of it has yet been found. It would seem, according to the archaeologists, that de Bruce's brutal visit to Faughart was a mere blip on the historic timeline of this ancient and sacred hill. Rather, the landscape here speaks of an ancient and deeply spiritual community, evolving and living in relative peace for thousands of years. That is, before de Bruce came along. I wanted to further explore the forge that had been found near Faughart, which seemed such a striking connection between Brigid and de Bruce, despite the sharp contrast in their modern legacies. So it was time to speak to archaeologist Shane Delaney and senior archaeologist Niall Roycroft, who were among the team of archaeologists carrying out and reporting the excavations between Faughart and Little Mill from 2002 to 2003.
One of the sites that I excavated, Balrigan, which is an early medieval site dating kind of between the 6th and the 10th century. I think the specialist kind of dated the souterrain ware there between the 8th and the 11th century. But one part of that site, we did find a huge spread of burnt material, which would have been within the enclosure site. And beneath that were a number of pits and evidence for burning, again with some souterrain ware pots, and there was a metal punch. So we think that was probably 7th to 8th century forge. And then just to the north of the site, outside of the site area, we found a huge area of the detritus of metal ore reduction. So we got a lot of slag, and we got a lot of what looked like fragments of items that had been melted down, and we got evidence for ceramics, metalworking ceramics, which probably represented the shaft of a furnace. So that would have been an area where they would have prepared the ore, which would then have been used in the forge inside the enclosure to create whatever items they wanted to create. Unfortunately, we don't know what kind of items they were creating. They could have been creating anything from bells to maintaining their own farm implements on that site. But I think that was the strongest evidence we had on the scheme for metalworking from that early medieval period.
What about jumping forward then to kind of 14th century when de Bruce would have been there?
No, the only site we had that was probably related to Edward de Bruce was Fort Hill, just next to the Shane's Balrigan site there, where it looked like there was a sort of, in response to the invasions, they might have moulded the hilltop into a 14th century fort, and that's why it was called Fort Hill. So there was a sort of Mott and Bailey sort of arrangement up there.
Was that done by de Bruce or as a response to de Bruce?
Probably as a response, because it seemed to have been occupied up until the 16th century. So when Bruce came down, he was 13, 15 to 18. So he was in and out 3 times very quickly. And he was basically just passing through. And he was using the Great North Road, which is the old road from Faughart Upper to Jonesborough, and Faughart Upper is obviously got the Brigid associations, and Faughart Lower was where we had a very large early medieval site with a cemetery, and that was the one that had the plough buried in it. So that always shows the agricultural richness of the area. But a lot of the richness was basically to do with this routeway from the north to the south that passed through this land. And so if you controlled the routeway by taxing people or whatever, you got a big income from that and you became very rich. And that could be one of the reasons why Faughart Upper site is so important. And that's why Bruce came down, yeah.
Brigid's father in some of the stories is said to have been a chieftain. Would it have been the likes of a chieftain who would have been controlling and taxing roads like that?
Absolutely. And normally what happens is when there's a chieftain, he usually has a couple of sons or whatever, and one of them becomes the replacement chieftain and the other one becomes a priest. And what you tend to find in these massive townland parishes, which is what Faughart is that you get a lot of interrelated sites, some of which are almost ecclesiastic, but they're actually just the priest site, because the priests were farmers too. And so you get, this is all a big family concern, if you like. Everyone's buying into that family, and they're controlling everything in that area. And that's their heartland. And then I think I'm right that the Faughart side continued its religious associations with, because it was taken over by Meliphant from County Meath. I think Meliphant had that land around Ballymascanlon, certainly, and maybe Faughart lower as well. That continues that religious association that they have there. But again, it's all coming down to the Great North Road routeway. It was the main communications route from the Anglo-Normans when they went from Dundalk further north, right up until fairly recently, because there were tower houses built along it in the south of Jonesborough to control this significant routeway through the mountains up there and into North Ulster.
There was a very large medieval graveyard found with over 700 remains found, but it has been stated that this was not connected with the Battle of Faughart, rather dating back to 600 AD and being used over several centuries. So it's dating a little bit later than Brigid, but it's closer to her time than to De Bruce's. But is it unusual to find a medieval graveyard of that size?
No, not on the large road schemes that have been done. That one is particularly large, but then the site was particularly large. So normally you'd get a graveyard which would be going with a sort of priest side of the family. There might be 100 or 200 people in there. Shane's Balrigan had 30, 40, 50 people. But one of that size is unusual.
Niall then supplies us with a clear picture of what we know about life in Faughart in the centuries between Brigid and De Bruce's lives, based on what was found in the local medieval graveyards.
The Faughart lower site ended up by being circular, about 110 metres in diameter. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it got taken over by Vikings because there was some hacksilver ingots found and some Viking knives. But then they probably just carried on burying there. And this is just one. There's another cemetery, early medieval cemetery, a couple of 100 metres away. So then they just fizzled out. The burial moves to the actual church sites.
Yeah. And I suppose when you know 700 remains were found, sounds like a lot, but when you consider that it was used over the course of several centuries, you know, it makes a lot more sense in that context. But all in all, from the excavation sites, from the M1 dig, there have been a massive selection of finds found spanning right back to the Neolithic. We've got all of this stuff in such a small area. Is it possible that the sites between Balrigan and Faughart were part of a much larger ancient complex like those in the Boyne or the Screen valleys?
Yeah, easily. Yeah. As Niall mentioned earlier, at the Balrigan confluence of the two rivers there is an antiquarian drawing of a massive ceremonial landscape featuring numerous enclosures, mounds, standing stones, and our site, Balrigan, which would have been about 60 metres in diameter, if you're to go by that map, is only a small site in comparison to the other sites that were there that there's no evidence for. And that's just one site.
So it's reasonable to believe Dundalk, or Old Dundalk at least, and the wider surrounds would have been quite a significant area, you know, maybe socially, maybe even politically.
Because it's quite a defined area as well, because there's the lovely Dundalk Bay is on the eastern side. To the north, you've got the mountains, and then inland, you've got the drumlins. So you've only really got this coastal strip as far as the River Glyde or whatever, and Annagassan. That is an extremely rich focus of archaeological activity throughout history. And what you tend to find is that the sites of early medieval period, for example, they wouldn't all cluster in the same place, but they'd all be within a few kilometres of each other and keeping an eye on each other. And they're all getting richer and richer as time goes on, because if Dundalk, you've got Dromiskin, and you've got Dundalk itself with its Castletown Mount, and then you've got the Balrigan complex at the head of the bay, and you've got the bay itself, access to the sea and all the coastal works that are going on there. And then you go up to the hills to the north, and so you're controlling the the communications, and you're in a defined area. That's just very rich. Well, North Louth is very different from South Louth, because South Louth was only tacked on there by the Anglo-Normans. So North Louth was always its own, but the Normans thought it was too small, even though it was very rich.
Yeah.
So they took a chunk of what's now Meath.
Yeah.
Put it into Louth.
And I suppose you are in a unique position for me to be able to ask an accusation that's often levelled at people in sort of early Irish history or prehistory, is that they were constantly warring. And it's interesting there, the way you say after the summer grazing or the winter grazing, there may well have been a big feast had where communities got together and met up and socialised with each other. And obviously socialising between communities probably would have been necessary for, procreating and inheriting of land, or once we got into that sort of thing. But was there much evidence found of infighting? I know we had the Vikings to deal with and all of that sort of thing. It's hard to imagine civilizations living right next door to each other in, as you say, such a small strip of land for such a long time if they were constantly killing each other.
Yeah, no, it's unusual in that all the graves that were dug up on this motorway project, there was virtually none had actually showed signs of murder or violence. When normally in an early medieval burial population, you would find people who have been killed and stabbed and various mutilations, but the ones around Dundalk, there wasn't. There was one burial at Faughart Lower. He'd obviously died somewhere else. And what they'd done is they'd wrapped him up in a sort of fetal position so that his bones had slightly come out, and obviously brought him back here from somewhere else. And, that shows people being looked after rather than violence, even though he might have died somewhere else.
There were fragments of a skull from the backfill of the souterrain in Carmore 1. But that may just have been bone that ended up in there. Maybe there's some burials just on the opposite side of the site that was outside of the CPO.
So it was Edward de Bruce then we have to blame for a disproportionate amount of violence in the area. I know it's kind of defensive to be visiting the Gap of the North or trying to hold the Gap of the North or anything like that, but do you think that the significance, whether it's the social or spiritual significance of the larger complex that we're kind of discovering here, do you think that would have influenced the level of attention that Edward de Bruce paid to the area during his time in Ireland?
Definitely. I mean, I'm not an expert on Edward de Bruce, but I know he was crowned High King of all Ireland in Dundalk.
Crowned himself, I think.
Crowned himself. He got there and he did it on the doorstep to make sure that when he went off from there, he was going from a position of power. So he felt it was a powerful place that he'd want to be associated with. To crown himself.
So it was a bit of a PR stunt. And do you think then that he'd have been paying much heed to the likes of legends about Brigid or other influential, potentially spiritual types who had existed there? So we talked about that at the Carnmore Kist Cemetery, where you had, that one central figure. Do you think legends about, people that had gone before there, that he would have been trying to maybe tie himself to that sort of thing and go, look, I'm as powerful in this area as those people were?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Castletown Mount is called Cuchullin's Castle. And that was where he was supposed to have had his base and overlooking the bay at one stage. So crowning yourself king there has massive associations with Cuchulainn the hero.
Thanks to archaeologists Shane Delaney and Niall Roycroft for joining us in this episode, and to you for exploring the ancient landscape of Faughart with us. Be sure to tune in next time for a trip to Anglo-Norman stronghold Roach Castle, just outside of Dundalk town. We'll be exploring the lineage and legends of the ancient Deverdun family. And we'll also be joined by amateur historian and historic reenactor John Kerr, who has a particular interest in all things Norman in and around Dundalk. Thanks to David Bellew on sound and to Dundalk FM for their support in making this programme. I've been your host, Tara Tine, and these are our ancient landscapes.